In this video I'm going to replace a broken gear in a Professional Series 600 KitchenAid mixer and then refill the gearbox with grease. The first step is to make sure that your mixer's unplugged so you don't get an electrical shock. The second step is to remove the screw at the back of the machine, and that will remove this strip and allow you to access the screws that open the machine. So this just comes off and exposes the screws that are actually holding on the top. There are 4 of these. Make sure you don't lose all the bits, but you're going to want them when you put the thing back together. After you've taken out the last screw, the top of the machine will just lift off. And I find it useful to keep the pieces inside the top of the machine so that I don't lose them. The next part involves taking off these 4 screws on the top of the gearbox, which will allow you access to the inside. Maybe a lesson on prevention is in order. So my KitchenAid is broken because I dropped a spoon into it while I was grinding, but I was using an attachment, and so the attachment uses this axle to spin, and so what actually happened is I stripped the gear that goes into this one, and I've already actually removed it because I had to order the new part. But it's this little gear here, and the teeth all broke off, and so I actually had to remove the grease that was free in the gearbox because it was full of pieces of small metal that were going to further mess up the rotation. So it's important to clean all of that grease out. So this is what the inside of the gearbox looks like after you've cleaned all the grease out, which you can do with any number of tools, scraper, or spatula. And after you get it cleaned out, you'll get a better idea of what's broken. My machine is broken because I've stripped some of these gears out, which of course is facing the wrong way for you to see it. And you can start to get an idea of where I've stripped the teeth off this gear, and I'll post a still of it so you can get a better idea what you're looking for if you haven't seen a stripped gear before. But I had to clean out all of the grease in the entire gearbox because it contained little pieces that I had chipped off. So it's kind of a mess, but it's really important to get all of that out so it doesn't interfere with your new gear or the remaining gears in the box. And what holds on this particular gear is a little split ring that's probably kind of hard to see. But once you get the grease cleaned off, you can see that there's a split ring, and on each side of the split there are 2 tiny holes. And the way you remove that is with this. It's a spreader pliers, and it comes to 2 little points, and there are attachments that can go on this, but for this particular job I don't need the attachments. So I'm going to insert the tips of the pliers into the holes on the split ring, pull the pliers apart, try that again, pull the pliers apart gently but firmly to spread the split ring, and that should enable me to lift it off. There we go. Lift it off this shaft. Maybe you can see better now the holes in it. Maybe I'll post a still of that too. So once you get that off, this broken gear will just lift off. And you can replace it with your new part that you order from the wonderful internet. And on the back, this is the new gear. On the back of it, you can see that there's this inlaid part, in-cut part, where it fits over this pin that holds on the bottom gear. If you need to replace this bottom gear, you just tap this pin out. That's what holds it in, and you can take off this bottom gear if that's what you've broken. So I have to make sure that when I set this new gear on, that that pin fits into this space. And if I insert it on this shaft and kind of twist it around, I can feel when it sets in there. And then I'm going to replace this split ring over the shaft to hold it on. And now all that remains is to refill the gearbox with the proper amount of grease. Make sure that it's the grease for the machine, which you can also order the same place you order your gear, and that's to make sure that it's non-toxic grease, because this is a kitchen appliance. And when I cleaned out my old gearbox, I kept the grease so that I had to have a rough idea of how much grease I needed to put back into the gearbox. And I'm not using this grease because it has pieces of metal from the old gear that came off and got stuck in the grease, and I don't want those pieces in the new gear or any of the old gears. This is a total misuse of my tools. And my grandfather would be disappointed in me, but that's okay. So I think this is actually a shrimp fork that I'm using, but you can use anything that works for you. It has a scoop on it, so I'm just scooping up some grease and kind of sliding it over the gears. Grease is what keeps metal parts from rubbing against each other and creating friction, so it's really important to make sure that all of the gears get greased. The housing is mostly in place to keep the grease from escaping, and so you don't actually have to get into all parts of the housing. But make sure that you get all of your gears to keep things nice and lubricated and running smoothly for you. Maybe a little bit more. Just kind of smearing it on top there. And again, my goal is to add back as much grease as I took out. Without, of course, making a giant mess that will escape to the outside of my housing. So when I finish with that, I can replace the housing. I gotta make sure that this little gear for the attachments doesn't fall out when I put the housing back on. And you can remember which way it goes. Well, it only fits one way, but you can remember because your attachment shaft goes in the front. Just sets back on there. And then I take my screws. Try to keep my own hair out of it. And as always, when you have more than one screw to insert, it helps to insert them all partially. Screw them in partially, not all the way, and then make sure that the top of your gearbox is seated correctly before you tighten your screws. This one by the board is always a little trickier. If you have trouble with it, your screwdriver, especially if it's a ratcheting one like this, may have an extender. Makes it a little easier to get in there. And now I'm just tightening down the screws on the top of the gearbox. And I should be all set. I'm going to test it before I put the top back on, just so you get an idea what's supposed to happen. KitchenAid doesn't recommend that you run the machine without the top on because of the risk of electric shock. And there you can see it's running while, and you can listen to try to hear any bits of metal that are clunking or making bad sounds inside there. It sounds pretty good, you probably can't tell. But you should be able to tell on your own. And the last part, of course, is to replace the top of the housing. Again, the part that your attachments insert into goes toward the front. And we will replace these screws as well. Now I'm tightening down my screws since I have the top of the casing seated correctly. Don't over tighten your screws or you'll strip them out and you'll have an entirely different problem to deal with. And finally, we can replace this strip that covers up all of those screws. Oh, and I'm doing it backward. The screw on this part goes in the back. Okay, and there we go. And let's give it one more trial run. Make sure everything is working. Maybe I'll even throw a beater on it. Just because, you know, the internet is fun that way. I'll have to take my word on it. It sounds a lot better than it did when it had pieces of gear floating around in there. But anyway, that's how you repair a KitchenAid mixer for, I think I paid $3 for the gear and $20-some for the grease, as opposed to $400 or $500 for a brand new mixer.